Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for a couple moments to make sure as many people have an opportunity to connect as possible, and we'll start our program very, very soon. We will start in 60 seconds. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lee Paddock. I'm the Managing Director of the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement. Today we'll talk about air monitoring technology, looking at the new and emerging technologies and recent technologies that are available for air monitoring. We will discuss a little bit of how that's helping deal with serious air pollution issues, and then talk about how information from that technology, whether gathered by citizens or government agencies, can be used in compliance and enforcement proceedings. INES is a network of networks of environmental compliance and enforcement officials, founded almost 30 years ago by the Dutch government and US EPA. Our work is in information exchange and capacity building. We work with the East Africa Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement, the ALERT network in Australia and the South Pacific, with a network called Red Lafika in Central and South America, with the European Prosecutors Network, and with the Asia Enforcement Network. INES has several programs. We have a capacity building hub that we're working on to identify capacity building programs for compliance and enforcement by organizations around the world. We're in the process of revising a basic inspectors training course. We do webinars which have focused on environmental justice and enforcement and in technology. And we have a community of practice on data analytics and artificial intelligence use and enforcement. About 2.5 years ago, we did a series of 6 programs on technology and citizen science. Those programs are available on the accessible on the INES website. So today we're going to focus very directly on air monitoring technology, and we have 3 really highly skilled presenters on this issue. Tim Dye, who is the principal at TD Environmental Services, which specializes in collecting and analyzing data using new technologies in the air monitoring area. We are also fortunate to have Jerry Opondo. Jerry is the founder and leader of of the East Africa Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement. He's a lawyer who's advised agencies, governments throughout the East Africa region. And we have John Cruden, who has been twice the Assistant Attorney General for the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the United States Department of Justice. He's been the president of the Environmental Law Institute, which houses INES. And John has been one of the lead enforcement attorneys on some of the most prominent environmental enforcement cases in the US, including the BP Horizon case and the Volkswagen diesel case. So we're excited to bring this expertise to you. And with that, one other brief comment, and that is, if you have a question, and we encourage questions, please enter those in the question and answer box on Zoom. So with that background, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Tim Dye to talk about what kind of technology is there out there and how can citizens and government use that technology. Tim, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Lee. Let me get my slides up. I think you should be able to see them now. So yeah, hi, good morning, afternoon, and evening, depending upon where you are in the world. I want to talk about kind of air monitoring, give you an overview of the current status of what's happening in terms of the technology, in terms of programs and what's needed, and some of the future trends that I see. And I've given this talk for about the last 10 years or so, looking out at the future, and have made some predictions and like to think about how things are going to change and some precautions as well. So any air monitoring program is really going to start with starts by asking questions. And this is something that's sometimes overlooked. Hard to believe, but sometimes it is, depending upon the group that's doing the measurements. But what do we need to measure? What pollutants do we need to measure? Where do we need to measure them? That type of thing. How will we measure these pollutants? So that gets into what sort of technology are we going to use to measure? And can that technology detect the pollutant of concern or pollutants of concerns? How well also relates to how you operate it. How you quality assure the data and do some things like that. And then you collect the data, and then the question is, what will you do with that data once you get it and once you collect it? All three of these things really need to be considered when creating any air monitoring program. One of the things that I've seen is kind of a wide use of technology, and I'll talk about that in a minute, used for all sorts of different applications. And I've listed some of the applications here. Air monitoring is used for AQI reporting, for data fusion, for enforcement activities, for inspection. And we'll hear more from the other speakers as well about how this information can be used, source identification. And it's really an exciting time as we see more and more technology being brought to bear, being developed, being deployed and used to monitor air quality in a wide range of different applications. Getting back to kind of air quality monitoring, one of the things that really has struck me over the course of the last couple of years is we have a long pathway to convert data into action. It takes a long time. And some people have said, after you finish collecting your data, you've deployed your network, your sensors, your instruments, whatever, you collect your data, that's when your project really starts. And I think a lot of people really, and we have a lot of new organizations coming into the community now with environmental justice groups, community groups, others that are starting to undertake this. But any air monitoring program really starts with an objective. Why are you making the measurements? And then selecting instruments and sensors, managing the data, probably quality assuring as well, operating the instruments, aggregating or merging the data perhaps with other information that's important, visualizing that, interpreting it, and then taking some sort of action. That action could be personal, I'm going to move, or I want to protect myself, I'm going to buy an air filter, or it could be an inspection, it could be an enforcement activity, and then ultimately some sort of benefit. All of this takes a lot of time and a lot of expertise to get all these different things done. And there's a lot of work here and a lot of skills that are involved. If you look at where the interest typically lies, there's lots of interest. What I see is in the hardware and the software. What devices am I going to buy? What sensors am I going to buy? What instrumentation? What software? How am I going to display that? And the actual monitoring program is much more complex and drawn out a lot more. There are other things here like enormous amount of meetings, planning, coordination. There's quality assurance that's layered throughout this whole area. There's review, assessment, perhaps independent audits. There's repair of equipment, replacement of equipment. All of that, quite frankly, is the boring stuff, but it's the critical thing. And I'm going to talk about technology. I'm going to show some different technologies, and it's exciting. But all this other stuff is probably more important, much more important than the hardware and software to some respect. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to show some examples of projects that we've been involved in and how that really played a role. Let's talk a little bit about technology. So pretty busy slide here, I know, but over on the left, we will look at some costs, some ease of use, some accuracy, and then how much data is produced. And then I've classified kind of 4 different types of ground-based air monitoring. There are others as well that we can talk about, in the discussion session. So let's slide all the way over to the right where we have air sensors. This is a technology that's about 12 years ago started coming about, really has taken off in the last 5 years. You can buy devices on Amazon. There are others out there, Purple Air, others that can detect a number of different pollutants. Anyone can use these. Anyone. They can buy it. They can deploy it at their house, walk around with it, like we see some high school students here doing that. The accuracy varies, and this is a huge challenge for all of us, from actually surprisingly accurate to garbage. Doesn't work. Just spits out numbers that have no meaning and no anchor, and they produce a lot of data. So there's some challenges with this. This can create a lot of noise and a lot of frustration, but there's also some great opportunities for education, awareness, and actually some other folks are starting to use this for more advanced applications. As we move over to the left, we have more portable instruments. These are more expensive. They're not as easy to use. You're going to need training and expertise to operate these. Training in the instrumentation, training in how to quality assure these, check these, repair these, and review the data. The data are going to be accurate. And then getting over into the kind of orange area, much higher grade instrumentation. We have reference instruments. So these are $20,000 kind of per instrument. That trailer down at the bottom there has probably 10 instruments in it. So the cost of that trailer is well over $150,000 or so or more. You need experts to do this. The data is very accurate. It doesn't produce a lot of data, per se, but this serves as the backbone for the air monitoring system for us in the United States and for other countries as well. It's critical to have this. An analogy is at airports, we don't have low-cost weather stations. We have very accurate weather stations because they're big decisions being made. We're landing planes. We need the same backbone reference network as well. It can be supplemented and augmented with other things that you see here. Sliding over to the left you'll see, the cost goes up. We still need experts to run this, but this is a remote sensor. There's a lot of these that are being deployed and operated now at fence line monitoring. It shoots a path across, reflects off of a mirror or something else, and we can measure pollutants that pass through that beam and get an integrated measurement. They're accurate. They can also be specific for certain compounds. And then lastly, and there are a number of these devices out there. These are instrumented vans that can detect almost any compound that's in the air at an accurate, very specific level. Obviously, these are expensive. They require experts to run, lots of training, lots of maintenance and quality assurance, and all the things that go along with that. The other thing I wanted to mention is there's different modes of monitoring, right? There's fixed base monitoring, there's mobile platforms, and I show a car here. There's an instrument package on the top of the roof. It's a project we did in Houston with the city of Houston. There's also mobile platforms like drones. And air quality equipment's been flown on planes before as well. There's satellites that look down. I'm not really talking about those, mostly focusing on kind of ground-based measurements. The coverage can be an area like a neighborhood, or maybe even larger like a small city, so we can get a regional idea of what's happening there. It can also be personal, and these can be carried around, and we can use that to monitor air quality. Another thing that I see, and it's really happening a lot more, COVID accelerated this, is people thinking about the air they're breathing, not it's indoor air that I'm breathing or outdoor air. I'm breathing air. And they're concerned about the air both inside and outside. And there's a lot more focus on indoor air than there ever has been. But I see it really combining of those. So how well are all these different technologies doing? As you remember, air sensors were the cheapest, and then we kind of rise to portable instruments that you can move around, reference instruments, the regulatory network, and then research and remote sensors. Air sensors, they do many of them out there do a real good job at measuring particulate matter. That's led to US EPA incorporating air sensors into a really popular product that they have called the Fire and Smoke Map. It's a great product where they combine reference data and air sensors. But in terms of some of the other pollutants, not there yet. It's just not. And that's a challenge, because as different groups buy low-cost things, that may not measure the pollutant that they're interested in. And as we move over to portable instruments, we start to fill in some of the green dots. And then as we get over into the more expensive equipment, we can see that, there are instruments out there, there are technologies that can measure all, wide range of these things. Still challenges with that, for sure. I also added black carbon here because one of the things that we see is there are groups that have deployed low-cost PM sensors, and they're interested in traffic pollution or diesel pollution or other things. Those low-cost PM sensors don't see that. And so now what we see is them upgrading to higher technology. And that's an interesting trend. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Some trends that we see, there's 3 slides here, and then I want to share a couple rules of thumb and 2 quick projects with you. The quality of the sensors is improving. So, we see that. I think one big forcing function for that, as the US EPA has developed performance standards or air sensor targets for ozone and PM, those are out, and then they're going to be targets for other devices that measure other pollutants like SO2 and CO and NO2. Those are coming out, I think, later this year. But that is a forcing function on the market that forces these manufacturers to develop better and higher quality air sensors. That's going to be good for all of us. As I mentioned, some organizations are upgrading air sensors. They're finding, hey, this air sensor is not really measuring what we want. And they want action. They want to improve health. A lot of the community groups are really interested in, we want to improve our health. We want to make things better. And if an air sensor is not going to get them there, can they upgrade to a higher technology and more rigor around running that study? And then would that data be used as evidence? The other thing that we say, and I mentioned this as well, is kind of monitoring total air, combining indoor and outdoor air. And there are a number of projects now that are looking at outdoor air, indoor air, and just saying we're interested in really people's exposure to air. We spend a lot of time indoors, so we ought to be measuring both. Some other major trends that I see, EJ funding going to drive major changes. There's an enormous amount of environmental justice funding being released by states, by the federal government. This is going to mean major changes. I think there are some precautions that I see that I wanted to just kind of highlight. I think there's great opportunity there for all of that. I want to highlight a couple of precautions that I see. I think there can be a rush to buy a monitor or technology or a solution. You know, like this device, if we buy this device, it's going to give us the answer, and then we're going to be able to get healthier air. And if you remember that first slide that I showed, it's a long pathway to action and solution. It takes a while. We worked with one group recently that was applying for some EPA funding, and they were interested in an air sensor technology. And when we started talking to them about their concern, that wouldn't have addressed it at all. And so we switched the technology and upgraded the technology to something better that would really address their concerns. And so I think that's one precaution. As that funding goes out, let's make sure that we're not just buying something and expecting that it's going to solve the problem. It may help, but there are many other factors as well. Another thing that I see is with all these new groups being activated and monitoring air quality and taking action and working on air quality issues, government agencies are going to be strained to respond. And we're seeing that in a number of different ways and helping out in some of that. The last thing, I love technology. I love air monitoring. I spent my career doing it, but I think we also have to ask the question, is air monitoring really going to indicate the real problem? Are there other ways to address that problem that could be done without air monitoring? And one of the things that we're looking at is traffic counting. It's a low fidelity, low tech way of really understanding what sort of trucks are moving through particular neighborhoods. We don't need to monitor for that. And so I think that's a precaution as well. And we ought to, take our eyes off some of the technology and look for maybe alternative ways. A couple last things that I see is one is, and this continues to expand, is hybrid networks, where we don't just rely on one technology, but we're using a suite of different technologies. And there's lots of money being spent on hardware. I think probably too much money's being spent on hardware and technology. And want to see more funding spent on some of the boring stuff that I mentioned, but important stuff, operating things, the meetings, the discussions, talking about how we're going to use this, bringing other stakeholders in so we can get some action. All of those activities take time, they take money, and it's important that we don't spend too much money on the hardware. Lastly, I mentioned that black carbon monitoring, I think, will increase. There's some exciting new technologies with that are a little lower cost, but we'll see that certainly emerge as well. Some quick learnings over the last 2 years. One is the 4X rule. When working with groups that are new to air quality, so maybe a new community group, a new organization, maybe a new university group, plan on spending about 4 or more times on meetings, listening, discussing, and really fully understanding each other. And that's been something that we've observed working with a lot of environmental justice groups, some universities, others that are new to the air quality domain. Planning for that's going to be important. Second rule that's going to help over to the upper right is the 25-75% rule. spend no more than 25% of your budget on the hardware and software, no more. That leaves you enough time and budget to work on the planning, the analyzing, the taking action, the getting people together, all of that stuff, all the quality assurance, things like that. And then the last thing I mentioned is there may be other ways to accomplish the goal without monitoring for air quality. And so, we have to look at that. What does that look like? And the lower right is blank because we're learning lots. I'm learning lots, and I hope to fill in. I'd love to hear about some of your learnings, what rule we should add there. I want to highlight two projects that we've worked on recently. This is one in Indore, India, and it met the 25-75% rule, and I'm glad it did. This is Indore, India is a city of about 3.2 million. They had one reference station, and in this USAID project, they wanted to understand PM 2.5 and what air quality was like around the city and other areas. The way we tackled this project was not just technology, it was people. And we deployed 20 PM sensors with clean air guides, local community members that maintained the equipment, that provided outreach, that did some intervention. And we did quarterly analysis of all that data, and we had meetings with these clean air guides, and it's fascinating. And in the lower right, you can see there's huge differences. This is in the Indian Air Quality Index. We have one station that's green, some yellows, and up in the industrial area, it's red. This project was probably one of the most cost-effective projects I've ever worked on. The whole project, beginning to end, hiring the clean air guys, the sensors, the analysis, everything was $60,000. And we spent very little on the hardware. Most of the money was spent on meetings, engagements, and working with the clean air guides. So this other project addresses the 4X rule. And this is a project we're working on right now. It's called AQ Earth. It's funded by the National Institutes of Health. We're working with the Tri-Chapter region of the Navajo Nation. They were interested in monitoring air quality on their land. They had a couple of purple air sensors, but they really wanted more higher grade instrumentations for measuring PM 2.5, NO2, and ozone. And we're using FEM grade instruments. This FEM is the reference grade equipment. And there's significant oil and gas in this particular area. So what we've done is to develop a really extensive network of local monitoring and have been deploying that. In fact, I was out there last week deploying that. The network, this is their area. This is in Northwest New Mexico. Albuquerque is way off the screen here to the lower right. This is the Tri-Chapter region. These are reference stations, so higher grade stations. So air quality considerations for this area are being made by this monitor over here, and perhaps these up here, a distance away, and a different environment as well. So what we've done is we've added in some three anchor sites that are reference grade, and then we also have some air sensors and reference equipment in this green area. And it's laid out this way because we want to look at kind of north to south gradients of air pollution and how do these pollutants relate to the stations nearby. I was out there last week installing equipment. Those of you that have been there, this is Chaco Canyon National Park. We're installing equipment on this tower right here. One of the things that we did, we spent 2 years planning this and coordinating and working and meeting with the chapters and the chapter presidents, planning logistics, going down last summer and doing a trial monitoring program. It's taken a lot of time. It's taken 4x the amount of time to get the equipment out there. Part of it is because it's a rural environment. So it's 200 miles to the nearest Home Depot here, 100 miles, probably 50, 70 miles to the nearest gas station. So a long ways away, but it does require a lot of planning. And it's kind of the boring stuff. It's not the exciting stuff. It's not the technology, but it's so critical because in 1 week, we were able to stand up this whole network and get it running. So with that, I look forward to the discussions. I'll drop my email in the chat if you want to reach out and talk to me at any time. Love to talk and look forward to the other panelists hearing their talk and the questions that come forth. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I have one quick question.
Uh-huh.
When government agencies historically have done kind of looking at air pollution, they do a lot of modeling to kind of understand the meteorology of the situation so that they can place their monitors in appropriate locations. And it looked like in that last project, there likely had to be at least some reference to air quality modeling to give you an idea of what kind of pollutants might be where. I wondered what kind of role the existing air quality modeling might have played in that project.
Yeah, in this particular project right now, I mean, we just fielded it. So I think some of the measurements could be used in looking at the modeling, because I'm not sure who's doing the modeling down there, but they're probably using this data and other data to model air quality for the tri-chapter region.
Mhm.
The question is, does the modeling really represent that? So with these measurements out there, one of the things that we'll be able to do is say, okay, here's the model results. Well, what do the measurements say? And validate the model. And that was one of the applications, that we talked about, or I talked about earlier on.
Good. We will move on to Jerry. We'll pick up. I know we have a number of questions already in the Q&A box. We'll pick those up after Jerry and John have an opportunity to present. So Jerry, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Lee. So let me just share my screen. I will just pick it from where Tim has left. And I'll be sharing some of the experiences that we've had in East Africa with the use of the low-cost air sensors, and some of the challenges that they portend for environmental regulation. So in East Africa, air quality legislation and regulation is fairly a new phenomenon. And many of our countries and cities are just, at the early stages of putting into place air quality management plans, regulation standards, etc. And we realize that, for the ambient air, monitoring is an important start of this whole process towards action. And just like Tim showed in the earlier presentation, the cost of reference grade monitors is quite high. Runs into a few to several tens of thousands of dollars, compared to, say, the low-cost sensors, which could be just a couple of $100. And for this reason, many of our countries and cities are resorting to setting up monitoring networks using the low-cost sensors. Community groups and other, players, academia are also deploying this recently. Especially, there has been a big explosion in the last 2-3 years. And this can range from, if you look at my slides at the bottom pictures, from some of the fairly fancy low-cost sensors, like the ones you see on the left, to more of contraptions like the one you see at your far right, which is basically a sensor that has been put together by some of the local tech researchers and then housed in a plastic casing. They're just protected, from weather conditions like rainfall and the like. However, for East Africa, we have experienced lots of challenges when it comes to the use of the low-cost air sensors. And these challenges, quite a number, and all of them go into the quality of the data that comes out of this. So you realize that, for regulatory agencies and countries and city authorities, the essence of putting out this sort of, air monitoring networks is for purposes of usually, to get an indication of, what the emission baseline, for the city or for the country would look like. And, this is meant to inform, what everybody now, advocates for evidence-based decision making. But then we are realizing that, with the low-cost sensor networks, it's a little bit of a challenge. And the first challenge is, with relation to calibration. A lot of times, the sensors are able and actually do get calibrated. But then from the experience we've had in the region, they quickly run out of calibration. Sometimes, in just a matter of weeks, and, you have to have somebody constantly, maintaining and recalibrating at very short intervals. Otherwise, you get very inaccurate measurement. Others have proved to, at the slightest change in, environmental conditions such as humidity, then they just, give you crazy measurements. So you could have your sensor up there, but in humid conditions, then it gives you totally, different measures. Other times, in Africa, especially with some of the dusty conditions in cities, due to many unpaved roads, again, this affects them in a big way. Also, we have this challenge that most of the air sensors will usually just measure a limited number of parameters. The ones that have been deployed in many African cities, particularly East Africa, will mostly do just PM 2.5 and PM 10. And so these have, for example, been connected to mobile apps where, for example, citizens can simply log in, view, and they can be able to, at their palm, be able to tell what the situation of the air quality at any given location is. But then the challenge with this is that, with just one or maximum two parameters, it's very difficult to tell the entire air quality story of a particular location. So what we then get is, sometimes, citizens, or, non-governmentals like our organizations, we put pressure on government to take action. But then the truth of the matter is, with just one parameter measured against a local sensor, it may not entirely be an accurate reflection of what the actual, air pollution situation is. So you could be getting, sometimes good PM 2.5 readings, but then you don't know whether out there, what the ozone levels or the nitrogen oxides are. And then in other instances, we've had, reports of, cross interference, where, for example, a local sensor is designed, say, to measure nitrogen dioxide, but then it ends up reacting to, other gases such as ozone and other nitrogen oxides. So then with this cross interference, you can't quite rely on what's coming out of the instrument. And then many of the sensors that have been deployed, especially in our region, are based on, crowdsourced hardware and software. And with this, the expectation is that, the end user is responsible for installation and location. And sometimes, you have citizen groups, you have, students, researchers, and sometimes even, city authorities. But then proper installation and siting of these sensors is also, very critical to the quality of, measurements that you get out of them, as well as, how frequently and how often you do maintain them. So then once, this is left to the end user, who sometimes, may not be in a position to actually maintain these instruments, then, you could be getting readings out there going, into, some of the apps that then relay this information out to the public, but, you can't quite be sure whether what you're getting there is really, what the situation is. Sometimes it shows you is really good when perhaps it's, very bad, or, it could be showing very bad when, it's not as bad. And then again, in terms of, aging and drift, a lot of these that are, more of over-the-counter kind of instruments that, you can buy online from places like, eBay and other online spaces. They are designed more as, consumables with very, very short lifespan. Sometimes, just a matter of months. But then you find, a sensor is located at a place, and 1 year down the lane, we still believe that it's giving us, correct reading, when in actual sense, its lifespan, has gone in the last, 6 months. So again, these are some of the challenges that we are facing with this. And, the biggest challenge perhaps is in terms of, how these things come into the market. So for East Africa, for example, there have been many different, types of sensors with different brand names coming into the market. Within East Africa, there is no regulation and no standards against which these should, be measured, and therefore we have all manner of devices come into play, and I would say causing a lot of more confusion than should be. So for purposes of, policy action and regulatory action, these are, quite serious challenges. Yet, many of our agencies are still, going in this direction of using this sort of sensors. So allow me to stop here, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
And Jerry, I just have a couple of follow-up questions before we turn to John. One of those is what in your experience has been the most valuable aspect of some of the use of the low-cost sensors. I know you spent a lot of time indicating the potential issues there, but I wonder if there's been some circumstances where you've seen positive results.
Thanks, Lee. So that's really a great question. And truth be told, despite all these many challenges that I outlined, the low-cost sensors have driven action, especially, in East Africa. From an environmental justice perspective, we have had some of these low-cost sensors, located in what you would call, poor neighborhoods, and depending on some of the results showing very bad air in some of these neighborhoods, cities like Nairobi, have been forced to take action, and start work towards making, the air cleaner in some of these places. Also, in terms of raising awareness among the general populace, the data coming from these, local sensors has played a very, very big role in raising awareness among citizens, and therefore making citizens, demand more action from government authorities. Thank you.
It sounds like awareness of the problems are really important, but having some of this technology nevertheless has proven to have some public policy value that's also important. One other note, it sounds also like the process that Tim mentioned, where EPA is developing some reference standards for sensor technology could provide a valuable contribution, not just here in the US, but elsewhere by setting standards for reliability, at least enhanced reliability of some of the monitoring sensors. All right, we will now move to John Cruden, who will talk about the issues that some of this data from newer technology can produce when you actually try to utilize it in some way related to compliance and enforcement actions. John, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee, and Tim and Jerry. That was excellent. I particularly love the stories of Africa and India and the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. I'm going to do three things. I want to talk a little bit about in the beginning about what's happened in all of our lifetime in this area, then say something about my vision of how this technology fits and where it will be in the future, and then end it with just a little bit about what's evidence. Well, how do we move from talking about it? How do we move to what's evidence? Before I do that, I want to do a shout out because all of this, all technology, when we're talking about compliance and enforcement, fits in a broader context, of course. And there's two good reference materials. Here's the book on Next Generation by Lee Paddock, which is excellent. And then just recently has come out by the Oxford University Press. Here is Next Generation by Cynthia Giles. It's wonderful. You can download it online. And I highly encourage you to look at that because these are sources that show you where technology fits into environmental enforcement and compliance. All right, first of all, my story. So I was at Department of Justice a long time. And here's how it evolved during my period at Justice. And so in the very first INEAS conference I went to, which was in Costa Rica, I was the speaker and presenter on technology as we knew it then. Remember, this is quite a while ago. And I was lecturing on something we had just done using side-looking airborne radar coming off of helicopters that would look out onto water, and you could see ships discharging oil illegally by using that new technology. And one of the East European heads of enforcement woman raised her hand and said, John, that's fine, but I'm actually working out of 3x5 cards right now. And so we haven't actually moved into things like side-looking airborne radar yet. By the time that I left Department of Justice, which I did at the end of Obama administration, two things were happening. First of all, we were asking and then putting into consent decrees that if you had big tanks, you had to use FLIR cameras, and the cameras could look and see VOC emissions that you could not see on your naked eye. Those were best available control technology, and that was getting to be just standard things that we didn't even dream existed back in the beginning. And then second, just in the usefulness of the kind of data that Tim and Jerry are talking about collecting. I was part of the John Kerry's delegation of the State Department going to Beijing to talk about, among other things, environmental issues. And while I was there, my counterparts at their equivalent of the Department of Justice, one of them told me that every morning when he got up, he accessed the data coming out of the embassy in Beijing, because that gave him air quality information and told him whether or not he should be going outside or not. And so we go from 3x5 cards in some places at the beginning of my justice career, but by the end, we're talking about pretty sophisticated air monitoring and FLIR cameras. I am completely supportive of both the concept of citizen science, some of the things that Tim was talking to you about, and certainly environmental justice, because some of what we're talking about in emerging technology has a real impact on communities that don't have a voice and have had historical issues associated with air problems, water problems in their area. So I'm very supportive of that. At the same time, I'm advising corporations. Although I'm advising corporations now that to be ahead of the curve, you have to be doing testing. You have to be transparent about what you're doing. You have to use the best technology because if you do that, that will actually be seen well in the community, but it will also get you ahead of any possible problems that you might not otherwise even know about. Here are 5 areas, though, that I see our future in technology influencing dramatically what most of us grew up with in environmental enforcement and compliance. Most of us grew up with inspectors going on to the site and taking sometimes as many as 2 or 3 days to go through a very important, highly trained, trying to find out system-wide compliance with our various federal and state environmental statutes. And there's still clearly a place for that. That's still important. But frankly, it's expensive, it's time consuming, and it also only gets a small portion of any particular area, geographic area, or industry, or environmental justice community. It only gets a small portion. So we have the possibility of broadly expanding what enforcement and compliance will look like in the future. And here's 5 areas. What Tim in particular talked about is something we've all talked about for quite a while, and that's the importance of monitoring. Monitoring, whether or not it's continuous emission monitors or continuous opacity monitors, but monitors that are on the site, and then some ability, whether or not it's fence line or elsewhere, and I'll come back to that. That's a check and balance into that kind of compliance. But monitoring has to be systematic. It can't be episodic. It has to be something done over a period of time in order to get good quality data. So monitoring has to be important. And then monitoring that goes somewhere, right? Monitoring that adds to the data, which I'll come to a second. So first of all, monitoring. If you are on site, if there's inspectors on site, then the effective use of those things that we're carrying around in our pockets right now, the effective use of iPhones and pads that link what's doing on site to the database that's back at headquarters somewhere. And so that challenge of uniting and integrating that kind of data is important. We've all seen the issues of not connecting that data and what that means, and that's a challenge for us. But it's the new technology of, again, smartphones and smartphone cameras that advances everywhere more than we are in the past. Third is aerial issues. Tim just mentioned the drones. The ECOS has done a study, which I urge you, as you can find it online there, about drones, which are somewhere now, but certainly in the future. Drones are just another form of remote monitoring. They raise obvious legal issues in terms of Fourth Amendment issues, in terms of privacy, in terms of accuracy, but nonetheless, without question, that will be our part of our future is from the air. And then my fourth would be even farther from the air, what satellites can do. We all have GIS technology right now. We now can look at places where there might be water issues. We can look and see where there are fires that might raise PM issues. We can all see that now, which we haven't been before, but now integrating that capability into smartphone technology and continuous monitoring, those sorts of things. So we have a composite database is going to be a challenge of the future, but drones and satellites would be part of it. And then finally, because I think it's on everybody's mind right now, we're reading so much about artificial intelligence, what it can do, concerns about what that would do. Lee Paddock and I together are teaching a course at George Washington University right now. We're giving a final exam, and we don't want them to use technology, chat technology, to answer the exam. But that's all there, and that's happening there, and effective use of that. Finally, then, what's evidence? Well, the evidence is almost always evidence that focuses on the credibility, the things that, that we already talked, Jerry already talked about it. You have to be able to prove that the instrument is valid, that it was used in a correct way, that the user was trained and there's an SOP for that. Those are the kind of standards that have long been with us, and they're going to have to be used even now more rigorous in order to get any of these monitoring technology, emerging technology, into evidence. Lee, back to you.
Okay, thank you. So we've got roughly a half hour left. We've got several questions that are waiting answers, and I have a few. And maybe I'll start with near the end where John left off. And so one of the issues about developing a lot of data is, and Tim mentioned this, is how do you make that data usable? Data analytics is a kind of a technology of its own that's emerging. AI is closely related to that, artificial intelligence. So maybe for Tim to start with, but any of you want to comment, what kind of role is data analytics playing, especially as we get a lot more data from different sources and we want to combine it with the existing data to make that data usable for compliance and enforcement purposes? Tim, if you have some thoughts.
Yeah. For compliance and enforcement, I'm not totally sure, other than I think it's really important in that planning stage to think about the end and to engage who's going to be using this data and what do they need. And there were a couple of questions in the Q&A about, regulators or officials won't use the data or not using the data. I think it's important in the planning stage to engage them and spend some of that 75% of your budget on meetings and engaging them. What will it take to produce data that you would use? And ask that question before you even begin monitoring.
Yeah, I want to chime in, Lee, on 2 points. And first of all, those of us in the environmental world know that one of the more effective statutes of all time has almost no enforcement. A part of it, that's a toxic release inventory. So publishing data, using data, being transparent about data can have a deterrent effect, even if it's actually never used in enforcement. That said, once we move into enforcement, then we see all of the issues that Tim raised and Jerry raised about the accuracy of the instrument, whether or not it's used for the exact right pollutant. All of those have to be used there, because to get any of that evidence, all of that would be relevant, and probably, as we've seen in other emerging technologies, sometimes not allowed into court because the data was not considered accurate.
And just to jump in, in the entire, regulatory cycle, from the point that you are designing, your measures in the form of legislation and requirements, if you don't get the data right, for example, in terms of baseline, how then do you set, standards that are implementable and enforceable? So these are some of the questions that we have to contend with. But then also, or for regulators, when you go out there and you have collected your data, how you analyze it and how then you get to interpret them, and how accurate that is determines what sort of enforcement actions you can take against violators. Thank you.
So I want to just take a moment here to turn the program over to Sarah Backer, who's INEE staff, just to ask one question or kind of a survey question for the participants. So Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
The poll is being launched, and if you could just take the time, it should come up. I see people are answering. We're going to do this for a minute. Oh, okay. Okay, great. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. That will help us inform our next webinars.
So there are a number of questions that relate to how this technology can enhance environmental justice. At least one of our participants noted that for many community members, the option of understanding there's more pollutants in the community doesn't mean that they can then move. They may not be able to afford to go to another neighborhood or to a place with less pollution. So I wanted to ask a few questions related to that issue. So one of the relatively groundbreaking studies of kind of neighborhood scale toxics pollution in the US was done in Los Angeles with multiple air toxics exposure studies, which occurred over a period of several years. And they basically used shipping container deployed technology, sort of that intermediate level of technology that you talked about, Tim, to find out what kind of air toxics were affecting a community. And not surprisingly, in Los Angeles, diesel emissions were by far order of magnitude more than benzene. So from any of you, a sense of the type of technologies that you're seeing that might best contribute to better informing communities about the kinds of exposures that they may have, and from a policy standpoint, other than people having to move, what government should be doing with that data. For example, identifying sources of pollution and taking enforcement action. Maybe we could start with Tim for your thoughts on that issue.
Yeah,
Especially in light of your work with the tribal, that recent work with tribal, because I'm sure that had either environmental justice funding or certainly implications.
yeah. I'd like to talk not about technology, a little bit about technology, but not really about technology. We did some work in the San Francisco Bay Area. There's a community group near Facebook, and sandwiched between Facebook, 101, lots of traffic, small community group. They came to the air district who we were working for and said, we know there are air sensors in our neighborhood. Can you analyze the data and tell us what you see? And so we looked at the PM sensors in that community, 1 mile radius outside of that community, and other areas of Menlo Park. And we showed that they were breathing air quality that was 23% more polluted. It was still below the standard, but it was 23% more polluted. And we know that PM has health effects, far down of the scale. So we presented this And the first thing they said was, thank you. Thank you for confirming our lived experience. But more importantly, what happened was they were working with the elected officials there and informing elected officials, what can we do about this? That was probably the most important outcome. You're right, they couldn't move, or some of them can't move. They're in the neighborhood. So the question is, what local controls can be taken to improve the situation? We think a lot of the PM is due to traffic and probably wood burning. So, but they could work with, and they were working with their council member that represented them and the mayor. They were involved in the process from the beginning, which is I think a good sign.
Jerry or John, any thoughts?
So from my standpoint, this question speaks to this whole concept of air inequality, and for some of our cities, what we see is that the quality of air that you breathe in your neighborhood is basically defined by things like social status and economic situation and the like. So Nairobi, for example, the fairly upmarket neighborhoods naturally have fairly cleaner air, but you go to the lower class neighborhoods, which are mostly situated around the industrial areas, because many of these people cannot afford to commute long distances to come to their workplaces. So then you get very poor air quality in this sort of places. And as the participants indicated, many of these people do not have the luxury to move into other neighborhoods with better air quality. But what this has meant, for example, with the use of data that wasn't really regulatory grade, basically data from the local census in some of these neighborhoods, is that this has led to pressure on the environment agency and even on the companies to take some action to try and better their air, and for Nairobi, for example, the city has recently legislated for cleaner air, and some of this comes as a result of pressure from residents of these neighborhoods that are impacted by this sort of merely by their situation in life. Thank you.
Lee, I would just say two quick things about, first of all, nobody should have to move because of what they find, but everybody, this is aspirational, everybody should have access to air quality in their neighborhood. Everybody, and my hope is things like what EPA is now created with environmental justice SCREAM. My hope is with some of the money coming in out of the Inflation Reduction Act to individual communities, we can see the kind of things that Jerry and Tim are talking about, that knowledge brings change, that transparency is positive so that everybody does have knowledge of what they breathe on an everyday basis.
So another question that touches on several of the comments or contributions to the Q&A relates to how government views data collected by citizens and the suspicion of the data, a question that the data quality may not be there with some monitoring technologies, yet citizens are using that technology, and if they detect something, they want some kind of a response for government. This also goes to Tim's point about the ability of government to respond. So I wonder if you have thoughts about how best citizens and government can interact if they're willing to interact, or in the early planning stages? And secondly, what should government staff know about and be thinking about related to the fact that citizens can gather a lot of information? So how do we remove some of that suspicion, improve the interactions between citizen monitoring and government? Tim, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple. One is, it takes time, right? There's some good signs here. I mentioned EPA's air sensor performance targets. Those are out for ozone and PM. That's a forcing function. And that's starting to unfold as manufacturers are going to be forced to develop better equipment. And the market, I think the market will help improve that. So that's one thing that I can think of. It's kind of the hard things. How do we get the government agencies and the community groups together, or the environmental justice groups together in the beginning? And I did see some really hopeful signs out here in San Francisco, where I am, and we're working with the Air District, but many of the groups that are applying for EPA funding contacted the Air District early on. And it wasn't just, hey, we want a letter of support. It was more, could you read our proposal? Could you look at it? Could you give us comments? Could you give us some ideas? Here's what we're thinking. And so that connection is made early on, and there's opportunities to perhaps suggest alternative equipment. We did that in a couple of cases. There's opportunities for the regulatory agencies to say, hey, here's some of the things we're going to need, and to have a dialogue there. What is that going to take? That's going to take a lot more time. It's going to take 4 times as much time. All those interactions, discussions, meetings on both sides. And we need to be prepared for that.
I think we're at the opening moments of the use of some of this technology. And what I liked about Tim's presentation, because he's in that world, is you could see by that presentation things that would work well and things that would not work well. When I'm lecturing on this, I very often go back to radar and gun radar technology, where the police are at the side of the road pointing something at us and then trying to take us into court because we're speeding. The opening moments of that was very uncertain technology, and it took several years, in fact, on both sides, for all of us that are getting tickets to realize it probably is good technology, but also police to learn how to use it and how to go into court with it, and to show that they were properly trained and that they were using it in the right way. It turns out that if you're doing air monitoring, there's actually science involved in how you do that, not just the technology, but where you go, how often you do that. Are you doing it episodic? Are you upwind or downwind? There turns out to be science in all that. And so that's part of what citizens are going to have to learn. And then as they do that, and as that it evolves and courts accept that, then I think we'll see more government receptibility to actually enabling citizens by helping them or actually giving them the technology that they know will work.
And I would add that, for government to win the trust of citizens, whatever they do with the technology, whether it is just, the monitoring or using the results of the monitoring for any action, it is important that citizens are involved at every stage of it. There has to be meaningful participation of citizens. Otherwise, suspicion will continue persisting. Thank you.
There's a question about the accuracy of government-based monitors and how citizens can rely on whether those monitors are actually accurate. John mentioned there can be questions about whether the monitors are properly placed or calibrated. I know of at least one discussion from our earlier citizen science webinars where some citizen-based monitors were cross-calibrated against government monitors, which might tell you one way or another which one was inaccurate. So, Tim, do you have any thoughts about how citizens can deal with concerns about the accuracy of government, maybe more sophisticated government monitoring, and whether they think the results might not be accurate?
There may be cases certainly where, the government monitors were maybe not operated properly, or there were instrument issues. I mean, this is complex equipment, so there's going to be some challenges, but by and far, that's high quality equipment, operated properly, independently audited. I'm gonna trust a lot of that data. It's an anchor. Every program that we do, when we put out low cost sensors, the first thing we do, where's the nearest government monitor? I want to compare, because I have a lot of trust in that data. One thing that the government monitors don't do is they may not represent a particular area, and that's valid. Doesn't mean it's not accurate. It may not be representative. So monitor may be sited in one side of the city, but it doesn't necessarily represent other areas. And we saw that in that Indore example in India that I showed. They had one reference station, run quite well. The data were accurate, good equipment, maintained, but it didn't represent the air quality in all of that city of 3.2 million. And so it's not necessarily representative, but that's different than accuracy.
I also wanted to ask about the engagement of university researchers in some of these projects, and whether you've had experience where technology experts from the universities can make helpful contributions to citizen monitoring by helping with selecting technology, QA, QC. Tim or Jerry, any experience in that regard that you wanted to pass on?
So for East Africa, our experience with the universities, has been a mixed one. And I guess is based on, how university research operates in this part of the world. So a lot of the air quality monitoring happening at the universities is research-based, funded research, and much of it, is not usually intended initially for public consumption, but rather for answering certain research questions. And a lot of times, by the time you get these results, is way after some of these have been published in peer-reviewed journals and the like. And for citizens and even government regulators, sometimes this is way too long after so the information is never useful in many times. And recently we had this forum where we had one of our colleagues saying that universities are trying to answer questions that have not been asked. So essentially they should work with policymakers and citizens to determine the questions to ask, rather than ask their own questions and then come to citizens and policymakers to try and have that information used. So in our case, it's been this kind of experience. Thank you.
I mean, Lee, I would say, since I started out by doing a shout out to the book that you wrote and Cynthia Giles wrote, and you both did it as university professors, you at George Washington and Cynthia at Harvard. I mean, obviously, I think there's a real place for university scholarship. I also particularly think it's in the area of integrating big data, artificial intelligence, and the things like air monitoring that Tim talked us through. It's one thing having that, but how you integrate that with everything else that you have, and that's particularly true in if you're trying to find out not just air issues, but air, water, toxic issues. If you're looking at things like the EJ screen. So I think there's a real place and yet a hole in some of this integration that the university community could be quite helpful for us in charting a future.
And I've seen some successes and some not successes. I think universities, the community is going to be there for a while, a long time, right? Their time horizon is 10, 20, 30 years. Communities may come in for 1, 2 years, 3 years, and come in, do things, and then leave. And the question is, what sort of deposits are being made in the community as a result of that? In the one case that I mentioned in South San Francisco with a triangular community, and we did that analysis, they're working with the university, and the university is focused in indoor air pollution and providing air purification systems to improve indoor air quality. And so I see that's a program that continues. It's making a deposit into the community and making something that's going to last after the university staff and organizations leave. I think if the focus is more on deposits, I think that's a good thing. So.
One of the things that we saw occur during COVID was the need for beyond the fence line monitoring of facilities, because inspectors couldn't go on site, at least not as frequently. I wonder if you have any thoughts about what might have been learned during that period of time about monitoring, and what that might have carried over into the way government might be doing business somewhat differently in monitoring, especially from outside of a facility. So maybe start with you, Tim, if you've got any thoughts about that.
Just a little bit. I mean, there's the remote sensors that I mentioned, that are fence line. There's also ones that can be driven around and point in different directions and measure things remotely that way. So, and that can be done well outside the fence line. That's expensive technology. So the question is, there's only certain organizations that can afford that, like the South Coast Air District and some of the other big air quality agencies. Will the price come down? I don't know. It's probably a market. There has to be a market there for the price to come down. So others?
I mean, there's no question that COVID affected all of our lives. The fact that we're doing this virtually right now is just an indication of things that we would have otherwise done in person. And we know now, of course, that some of the inspections were done during that COVID period were done virtually as well. And I think that's going to continue. I think that, for all the reasons that Tim and Jerry have outlined, that we're going to see that more in the future, where we're using remote data, we're using things that are coming from other sources, and then the inspector is then talking to the company virtually, and then using the data that it has to challenge whatever data the company has. So I see that pretty much maybe a lesson out of COVID that we were forced to do is to more remote actions, which carries over even into inspections.
One other question that we received relates to basically the idea of crowdsourcing data. So we know that some of the technology, the sensors may not be accurate, but is there value if there is a lot of data from different data points, crowdsourced data, which maybe any individual data point might not be accurate, but taken together could indicate a problem. So Tim, your thoughts on that?
We're doing a project right now that kind of looks at that. So it's for Air Quality Agency in the greater San Francisco area. They have what, 20, 30 reference stations that monitor PM 2.5, probably 20 or so throughout a 9-county area. And we got a hold of Purple Air data. That's a low-cost air quality sensor. 4,000 stations. 4,000. Processed all that data for 5 years. And now they're going to start to look at that and ask the question, can we see, are there differences? Does our reference station represent this area? Now we can ask that question. And we can look at that. So, I think it's just super exciting times because data of that massive amount of stations is going to tell us something. Probably confirm a lot of things, but also, who knows? It's exciting too that, governmental agencies are asking these questions and starting to look at that. That's, I think, a really good sign.
So we have several comments here, and we've talked a little bit about it already, about and Tim, you talked about it at the beginning. Lots of concerns from citizen organizations that they are developing data, they are giving it to agencies, and it's being ignored. So what can be done, given the fact that citizen data of this type is relatively new? What can or needs to be done within agencies to expand the receptivity to data from external sources that previously might not have been available? Kind of a philosophical administration question, but Jerry, do you have some thoughts about that?
So whereas this sort of data may not meet the high scientific confidence in some of these measures, generally speaking, in our region, this sort of data is already driving action. It's not the sort of data that agencies can walk with into a facility and issue orders or shut down and this sort of things. But then it's already putting pressure on agencies to take some actions. In some instances, I know agencies have written letters requiring remedial action, and industries have acted even on the basis of those letters. I know these are some of the things that may not pass in a court of law, but then in terms of putting pressure on agencies and institutions, I think it's working. Thank you.
I think, Lee, though, also citizens have to be aware that there are a variety of uses that the data or actions that they take can be of value to the government. It's not all going to result in some instantaneous enforcement action. That's just not going to happen. It doesn't happen with the government's data, so it's not going to happen with anybody else. But number one, Tim was already saying in his experience, it could tell you something about the area that might in fact affect targeting by an agency. It might affect where they put their own inspectors. It could affect environmental justice grants. There's a whole range of things that data could be of value to the agency that the citizens might not know, and they might not be told for one reason or another. So I think they have to be aware that not every one of them is going to turn into some gigantic enforcement action, but rather it still could have a very positive effect on some other aspect of enforcement and compliance.
And I think I'll just do it quickly. I think things are moving really quickly. We've been monitoring air quality for 50+ years. Low-cost air sensors have come on the scene the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I heard lots of concerns from EPA and the state agencies, but they've undertaken lots of things. Sensor performance targets, they published guidance. And look what's happening now. EPA is using air sensors in a public product to inform the public, the fire and smoke lab. I just mentioned that an air quality agency out here in San Francisco is beginning to look at this data and what it can do. So I think, that's in the last 5 years, and that is probably fairly quick. So.
Well, Tim, that on that note that let's stay at it. It's new, and let's hope that more of this data can inform better decision making and ultimately improve public health, which is everyone's goal. So with that, I want to thank our panelists, thank all of our attendees, and I wish you all a good day. Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Goodbye.